Welcome to Business Smarts Radio with Tom and Dr. Dave, the clean approach to building your successful business. Now, let's introduce Tom Borg and Dr. Dave Miles. Welcome to Business Smarts Radio with Tom and Dr. Dave, where we bring you the clean approach to building your successful business. And when we mean clean, we're not talking about spigot, span, and dust mops. This podcast is all about the acronym CLEAN. We're all about communication, leadership, engagement.
And no drama.
And I'm telling you, there's plenty of that around now. You don't need any more at work than they have. So today we are going into the first of a two-part series on how to leverage EQ, emotional intelligence, to increase performance. So with that, Tom, what about, why is it important? What is the big thing about emotional intelligence, somebody's EQ? Why should they care?
Well, emotional quotient is extremely important because it's part of our psychological makeup. We find in the research that has been conducted and what we're seeing happening today, especially this year with all the stress that's going on, organizations that have leadership that possess high levels of emotional quotients do better. They just have a better way of working with the people that are in the organization. And as a result, they're more sensitive and able to deal with the challenges their clients and customers are facing. So emotional quotient is not just something that sounds good, but it's something that's been proven to show time and time again that the higher the level of emotional quotients we have within an organization, starting at the top, working its way down to the front line, it has a dramatic impact on the health of the organization and also the bottom line.
Yes, and it's I wanted to tell the listeners, like I said, you hear the words emotional intelligence, emotional quotient, and really in a lot of arenas, you look at your EQ, or emotional intelligence, is more than IQ, it's more important, and it really makes a big impact. And the higher up you go in an organization from a leadership perspective, the more important emotional intelligence is. But most of the time, just for convention's sake, most places do not abbreviate emotional intelligence EI. So I'm checking, I'm measuring somebody's IQ and their emotional intelligence. They just pretty much abbreviate it as EQ or emotional quotient. So that way, the terms are kind of interchangeable. So if you hear us using emotional intelligence and emotional quotient, the terms EQ is pretty much interchangeable. But I wanted to give you a really quick, there's a lot of academic definitions out there. And there's a couple that I really like and I would like to throw out there. But, we wanted to, for this podcast, to really put it as simply as we could and try to stay out of the weeds. So I looked at one of the most simple definitions I could find and just honestly put simply emotional intelligence, or EQ, just the ability to sense, understand, and effectively apply emotions so you can be more collaborative and productive with others. That's really, when we're talking about EQ, that's the context that we are phrasing it in. I also found a couple other things that I liked that I thought was really good. It talked about EQ specifically, and I'm working from some notes here. Talked about EQ being a foundational quality that can impact our ability to use our skills and talents to be effective in different situations. And I like that because just because you have the skill to do something, you have the talent to do something, if your emotions run away from you, if you're triggered and you're upset or something goes on that's not quite right and you have an emotional response to it, that can really impact those. You're not going to be able to use your skills and talents to the same degree as if you were calm and level-headed and everything was good. So, when you look at measuring somebody's EQ, your level of emotional intelligence, it's looking at your ability to sense and understand and effectively apply the power of acumen to your emotions to be able to facilitate those higher levels of collaboration and productivity that we talked about. So It's really important to understand, I think, the makeup, that emotional makeup. And once you understand it, I think you can really apply that to your success.
And Dave, we've all seen it. We've been in organizations, either we've worked for the organizations or we're running organizations. You've got people within that organization that kind of on a high emotional level where something goes wrong, the whole room blows up. I remember years ago, I worked for an organization and the CEO was just that way. The meetings were not very productive when he was in a bad mood. Nobody wanted to say something that was going to rile him up or offend him. even though it might have been the truth, because unfortunately, this gentleman's emotional quotient or IQ or EQ was lower than it should have been.
Yeah,
Simply put.
and you're right. I mean, and if you think about it, I mean, we've talked about it several times before. The old adage that people don't leave organizations, people leave people.
Right.
And if you're going into meetings all the time and somebody's just flying off the handle and they're just, all over the place like that, do you really want to work in that kind of environment? Does that build a strong, healthy organizational culture that people feel safe coming to?
Well, you've worked with clients. I've worked with clients the same way, where I've seen the decision makers are just that way. And people tell me it's the worst thing to have to come to work on a day when that guy's having or that woman's having a very bad day, because it just gets them all stressed out. It gets them very emotionally defensive in those situations. And as a result, hey, their productivity goes down. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So, our next point that we were going to talk about, we talk about not just what is emotional intelligence, but how having a high EQ could help a business leader or frontline worker. One of the things I'd always been very into studying emotional intelligence when it comes specifically to leaders and leadership, and that was kind of really my lane in it. And the more I've really been looking at it in the last few years, I realize how important it is, not just for leaders, because it does. I mean, the higher you go in the organization, the more important having a solid foundation EQ is. But what I've noticed is that for high performers, it is really, we talked about that in our 4-part series on 4 strategies to navigate the next 4 quarters about emotional intelligence, how much that really affected. 90% of high performers were very high in emotional intelligence, and that was one of the key things that came out from Daniel Goleman, who, I mean, his groundbreaking work in the 90s was really what brought it out to the mainstream as far as business and just the community in general. But he talked about in his research that 90% of the difference between star performers and average performers in the workplace was related to EQ.
Yes.
And that just blew my mind. I'm like, so it's not just a matter of talk about the roles that emotions play in conflict resolution and collaboration and innovation and other key successful things in the culture. How important is it to have people in your organization that are good at conflict resolution and collaboration and innovation? I mean, how important is that to your organization? And I mean, it's a huge deal. And they found, there was another study that found why it was important. I think it was an older 2009 study that 65% of employees that they say they received no positive recognition at work. And where that really hurts is how that can make a difference between a disgruntled, low-performing workforce and one that is, high-performing, balanced, and productive. And I think really EQ makes the difference, because there's a lot of statistical research linking, employee engagement levels and productivity.
Yes.
Well, this is something that is, they say 65% are receiving no positive recognition, and a lot of that ties back into the emotional intelligence of the leader.
There you go.
That those things, you start connecting the dots and realizing how important this is over here to the productivity over there.
Absolutely. Dave, and that's something that all of our listeners probably can identify with in some way or another in their own past experiences and what they're seeing today in their own organizations. But you're absolutely right. We need to have that awareness level and to be able to, if we know, well, there's tools out there that we use some of them ourselves with our clients that will measure a person's emotional quotient, and at the same time, what they can do about that to raise it up. Now, that'll be the topic of our next podcast, but to recognize that these things do work together, just like you said, it's all connected. And if we want to have a company where there are individuals that are engaged and they enjoy coming to work and they collaborate well, then we've got to have this emotional quotient health within the organization.
No, I agree with you 100%. And I mean, most people, when you look at it like, okay, well, maybe I do want to, find out what, where my emotional intelligence level is and kind of where I'm at, and at least be able to start from there. Unlike IQ, it is a lot easier and a lot more able to develop and improve your emotional quotient, your emotional intelligence, than necessarily. I mean, I know it's not apples and apples, but you could technically get a 20-point jump on your EQ, and it's harder to get a 20-point jump on your IQ.
Yes.
But a lot of folks, they don't know exactly what is involved in it. And when you look at Daniel Goleman's books and his research, he really breaks down 5 pieces of, well, what is emotional intelligence? What does it break down to? There was really 5 different things that he
Hmm.
talked about. And it's something that if you understand this, it kind of makes sense. And I want to make sure the listeners knew. So
Yes.
knowing your emotions was a big one.
Hmm.
Being able to manage your emotions. Those are the first 2. The third one was being able to motivate yourself. Motivating yourself is a big part of emotional intelligence. The next 2 pieces are recognizing and understand other people's emotions, and then being able to manage those relationships or manage the emotions of others. How good
Hmm.
are you at reading the room? How good are you at being able to realize that, somebody is not potentially not in a good place, and maybe this isn't the time that we need to bring up this topic, or maybe this isn't the time to do this, say this, whatever. I mean, how good are you at being able to, like I said, manage your emotions, but also read the room and read other people's emotions and be able to make decisions based on that. So I
That's
think
right.
those things are super important.
Right. We're talking about a person's awareness level of being able to read other people's emotions, certainly, but also being able to tactfully handle those situations so that they're able to help that person when they need that type of support or maybe information or knowledge that comes from the leader. So what we're saying is to be aware of other people's feelings and emotions and being able to manage your emotions and how you deal with other people. Those go together so well, so well.
No, I definitely agree. So how I guess we all talked a little bit about why it's so important in the business world. So
Mhm.
I think that part we've already covered. But what are
Yes.
the things that we can do to measure a person's emotional intelligence?
Well, there's a number of great emotional quotient measurement tools on the market, one of which we use, which is outstanding, it's an easy assessment to take. Typically, we would administer that. It usually takes about I think 10 to 12, 14 minutes to complete that
Yeah,
section of it.
15 minutes tops. And
Yeah,
sometimes it could be a standalone assessment, and
yeah,
sometimes it can be integrated with, say, behavioral and communication styles, driving forces, and such.
yes.
I know I personally like doing that because it doesn't just give you that one standalone thing.
Hmm.
It incorporates all these different pieces of the how you do what you do, the why you do what you do, and it blends all that together so you can take all those individual pieces of
Oh, yes.
information and blend
Hmm.
them together to get the best results from all of that.
Absolutely. Well, the one that we use is the Trimetrics EQ through Target Training International. What we find with that one, when we use it with our clients, is that you get a really nice holistic view of this individual.
Mhm.
Certainly, get a look at the behaviors, the driving forces, what motivates them to do what they do, and then that emotional quotient. But how do these things work together? You see, because in some cases, the driving forces will support the behaviors, and then there's another side of that. There's areas where it's going to fight those behaviors. So the driving forces will actually repel the behaviors. Now, when we look at the emotional quotient, that comes together as well. So when we can see a holistic view of that individual, now we can come up with a strategy that we can work with. And we'll talk more about that next time, but how we can actually raise that level of potential for that individual.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing that I like about it is the fact that, when you can put all the pieces together and you can see how one fits in with the other, you realize that, okay, well, my natural tendency may be hot headed, but I've developed a really high, but it doesn't show as much maybe at
Hmm.
work because I've developed a really high level of emotional intelligence and I'm able to really tamp that down when I need to.
Hmm.
Just because you might have a tendency to do that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to happen.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's the key is to be able to be aware. I think it was one philosopher that said, know thyself. So when we're able to know who we are as an individual, we're then able to take appropriate action to improve ourselves or to take appropriate action to interact with others in a way that's best for that situation.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So we're going to talk about in our next episode 10 ways to actually go in and develop and the things you can do if you find
Hmm.
out, hey, maybe I need to develop a couple of things. Maybe I need to know my emotions better. Maybe I need to learn how to manage my emotions better. Maybe I learn how to read the room better versus managing those relationships or the motivation. Lots of ways to improve your emotional intelligence. We're going to talk about 10 ways to improve your emotional intelligence in our
Mhm.
next part of this podcast on part 2. But what were some books or some resources that are available that our listeners could look at and
Sure.
maybe try to get a head start on finding out about emotional intelligence?
Well, Dave, the one book that you've got there, the initial book, did you have that handy? You could show that to me.
Actually, I don't, but you
Okay,
go by
that's fine.
Daniel Goleman's book.
Yeah. Okay,
Yep.
great.
It's got
That's a
2
good
books.
one. Yep. Here's another good one that is excellent. It's another one by Daniel Goleman. If you can read that, can I get that
Yep, you
just
got
right
it.
for you there? Okay. Yeah, this is a great one for working with emotional intelligence. So he goes into a lot of depth with examples and uh, case histories and how people have been identified as having certain levels of emotional quotient and how they were able to raise it up and as a result develop more of that potential. So that's a great one there as well.
So I think it's more those 2 books are probably the ones I would recommend the
Hmm.
highest on that, and that is more of a 1-2 punch. You got the original book, Emotional Intelligence, that tells what it is, how it is, why it is. I mean, just in depth about it in general. But then that
Hmm.
second part, okay, now how do I put that to best use?
Yes. How do you work with it?
How do I work with it? How do I put it to use? How do I actually be able to put this into some kind of productive use? It's like, so it's just not gee whiz factor. Oh, all right, great. That's
Hmm.
fantastic. Now, okay, so what? What do I do with it? Gee whiz. Now what?
Hmm. Yeah, I
What's
think
the
that's the key is to become educated on just what it is, how it works, and then the more information you have, the more comfortable you're going to feel using it. And
Yes.
of course, next time when we talk, we'll give them some great ways of enhancing that emotional intelligence and bringing it up, moving that dial to the right, so that they actually become more competent when it comes to their level of emotional quotient or emotional intelligence.
All right. Well, sounds good. Any last words or thoughts for the viewers for this
I think the
episode?
main thing is just that there's always room for improvement. And I think if we can be open to that, we're always going to be able to look for better days heading our way.
Yeah, I think so. I think if you kind of realize the impact that emotional intelligence can really have in the organization, you realize how important it is to
Hmm.
to integrate that in. Not that you're communicating on the right levels and you're able to communicate with the folks and you know what drives them, motivates them,
Hmm.
and be able to work and break down some of those silos. And like we like to talk about a lot is appreciating the differences of others, not just tolerating the differences of others. I
Hmm.
think this emotional intelligence is really that last piece on top of it that really ties a lot of this together and being able to implement a lot of that more effectively. So I would definitely recommend going and getting the books, taking or the audiobook, Kindle, the regular book. They've been out for a while, so they're not terribly expensive. 2 great books from Daniel Goleman, one called Emotional Intelligence, one called Working with Emotional Intelligence. So I'd highly recommend those 2 books. And other than that, that is it for this episode of Business Smarts Radio with Tom and Dr. Dave, where we bring you the clean approach to building your successful business. We talked today about how to leverage emotional intelligence to increase performance. And so this is part 1. We will do part 2 of that next time on 10 ways to improve your emotional intelligence. So you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.